With an average job size of $5,000 and a rapidly growing global community of buyers and providers that numbers in the hundreds of thousands, oDesk is changing how the world works. We are the marketplace for online work teams with the best business model for both buyers and providers. Our unique approach guarantees that an hour paid is an hour worked, while also guaranteeing that an hour worked is an hour paid. In this video, we'll be providing some background and a summary of findings before looking at the actual 2008 country statistics of Canada, India, Pakistan, Philippines, Russia, Ukraine, and the United States. We'll then look at how this data can be used by outsourcing buyers and freelance providers. Finally, we'll cover the methodology used to generate the information contained in this video. As mentioned in the first slide, oDesk is the leading marketplace for online work teams with over 125,000 professional contractors around the world providing services to outsourcing buyers via our unique work and payment management system. The graph below shows that while the average job size on oDesk is $5,000, the global demographics are wide and varied. So, considering the background provided, let's take a look at some of our findings related to global outsourcing. First, U.S. providers have the greatest numbers and highest feedback. Second, the Philippines boasts the fastest growing community of providers, specifically in data entry and virtual assistants. Third, India continues to dominate the software and web development category with the greatest number of new hires. And finally, considering software and web developers, their average rate is 3 times that of writers and assistants worldwide. If you look more closely at the data in the table below, you'll see specific rate, size, and feedback information for the top 7 oDesk provider countries. Looking more specifically at this data country by country, we see that Canada has a total of 3,581 providers with an average hourly rate of nearly $20 and an average feedback score in excess of 4.3. This average hourly rate is consistently above the oDesk average, which may be explained by the fact that feedback ratings for this country's providers are also consistently above the oDesk average. Here, we can see the breakdown of Canada's jobs with a heavy concentration in development, design, data entry, and consulting. And finally, we see that the number of hours worked by Canadian providers has increased steadily over the last few years. Moving on, we see that India has a total of 27,454 providers with an average hourly rate of $12.52 and an average feedback score just under 4. Just the opposite of Canada, India's average hourly rate is consistently below the oDesk average. As with their hourly trend, their feedback ratings have also been consistently below the oDesk average. The greatest concentration of work performed by Indian providers, as stated earlier, lies in development. And finally, as the Indian provider market continues to mature, the increase in the amount of hours worked has slowed down considerably. Here we find that Pakistan has a total of 5,960 providers, more in line with Canada, as with their feedback score in excess of 4.3. However, it's interesting to note that the average hourly rate for Pakistani providers is almost half of that enjoyed by their Canadian counterparts. In spite of their feedback scores, Pakistani providers, as with India's, average an hourly rate consistently below the oDesk average. Here we can see that, while it has fluctuated over the last few years, Pakistani provider feedback ratings are currently near the oDesk average. The greatest concentration of work performed by Pakistani providers is in development, followed by data entry and design. And finally, as with the Canadian provider market, there has been a constant increase in the amount of hours worked by Pakistani provider network over the last 2 years. Recognized earlier as the fastest growing community of providers, the Philippines has a total of 17,213 providers with an impressive 4.3 feedback score average. However, due to the nature of the work performed by Philippines providers, the average hourly rate is just over $6. Here we notice that the Philippine provider's average hourly rate is consistently below the oDesk average and falling, again, as will soon be explained by their outsourcing job types. Overall, Philippines provider feedback ratings have consistently remained near the oDesk average. Noting that nearly half of the work performed by Philippines freelancers occurs in the area of data entry, we can understand the difference in average hourly rate. And finally, we can see that the Philippines provider network has seen explosive growth in the number of hours worked in the past year. Moving over to Russia, we find a total of only 2,721 providers with an average hourly rate of nearly $17 and a standard-setting 4.36 feedback score average. The average hourly rate of Russian providers is now above that of oDesk providers and continuing to rise. Not surprisingly, Russian provider feedback ratings have been rising steadily, no doubt contributing to their similarly rising hourly rate. Here we can see that Russian freelance providers focus disproportionately on development. And finally, we can see that the Russian provider network has been growing steadily in its hours worked over the last 2 years. Further inland, the Ukraine hosts a total of 2,929 providers, an average hourly rate of just under $16, and one of the higher feedback average scores at 4.39. As with their Russian counterparts, the average hourly rate of Ukrainian providers is now above that of oDesk providers and continuing to rise. The Ukrainian provider feedback ratings have been consistently above those of oDesk as a whole. Again, as with Russia, there is a disproportionate concentration on development among Ukrainian freelancers. And finally, we can see that the Ukrainian provider network has also grown steadily in its hours worked over the last 2 years. Rounding out the top 7 provider countries, the United States contains the greatest number of total providers at 52,637, each earning an average hourly rate of around $18 and a top average feedback score of 4.39. The average hourly rate of U.S. providers has been consistently above the oDesk average. Accordingly, the average feedback score for U.S. freelancers has also been above the oDesk average. Concerning job type, U.S. providers have focused on data entry and consulting, followed by development and design. And finally, we can see that the United States provider network has grown steadily in the number of hours worked over the last 2 years. So, we've covered a wealth of freelance and outsourcing data from some of our top countries. What's the best way for you to use this information? As a buyer, you should now have a better idea which countries provide which skills and what you can expect to pay for those services accordingly. As a provider, you should now have a better idea of how rates, feedback scores, and job type compare both in your own country and around the world. At this point, everyone should be able to see why the oDesk model is truly the best for both outsourcing buyers and freelance providers, and how we're changing the way the world works. The preceding data was mined from providers with hours worked on or after January 1, 2007, with greater than 0 hours and a $1.11 hourly rate. Please feel free to visit www.odesk.com/trends for more up-to-date information on country, job type, and provider information. Thank you.